Now, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's Ascender Asia's webinar on how you can be ready for the new future of work in 2021. Now, my name is Eugenia Tang, Head of HCM Business Development at Ascender, and I'll be your organizer for today's presentation. Just a little housekeeping before we start. All attendees will be placed on mute during the webinar session. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in your control panel. We will have time for questions close to the end of the webinar. Today's webinar will be presented by Ina Warburg, General Manager of Ascender Asia Services, together with our guest speaker, Alvin Khan, industry experts in talent insights. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to you, Ina.
Thanks, Eugenia. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I'm really glad that you could be here today. We've got a really interesting guest. So Alvin's going to be sharing a lot of deep insights with us about how sort of the development of talent and that side of the business looks at today, and especially in light of data. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction from my side. So maybe first to explain who I am a little bit. So I'm the general manager, like Eugenia said, of Ascender's Asia Services. That means I run a business that spans across essentially everything that's south from Japan and north from Australia. So a fairly broad area here in Southeast Asia and beyond. And I'm definitely coming at this conversation from, I guess, a business management point of view, and so trying to bring in those dimensions into the conversations with Alvin. So I hope that's going to be helpful to you. So Ascender recently completed an annual employee survey. We usually ask our customers and our sort of survey group about the accuracy of payroll, but this year we also surveyed them about how they look at the way of working as an impact to the COVID pandemic. And the results were very interesting, but probably also very well aligned with other surveys that have been done in this space. More than half of the population that we surveyed wanted to continue to work from home. They found this to be a good way to stay more productive, but also on the other hand, on the flip side, I guess, sort of working longer hours is part of it. A dimension that we also saw that was quite interesting was that a significant part of the Australian population were prepared to sacrifice some part of their salary to work more from home, whereas in Singapore and Malaysia, we didn't really see that tendency. And I think we can speculate around why that might be. And some of the things that we see in Asia is that often housing is shared with multiple generations. So it could be that it's sort of very crowded where you're working from, and you'd rather go back to the office just to get a bit more peace. So I think, Alvin, when we talk later as well, it's quite important when you look at data and results that you overlay those with sort of cultural dimensions as well, so that you get a good understanding for why it might be that numbers point in a certain way. But I'm sure you'll have views on that. So moving forward, because I'm keen to get to Alvin's part of the presentation as well. What we're going to be talking about today is, of course, that we're going to just touch on strategy development, and then we're going to move to some exciting areas around talent optimization and the future of work. So I'll just sort of segue into the strategy development right here, and coming at it from my perspective as, again, someone who manages a business. A lot of organizations had to reevaluate their strategy, and they had to look at how to, I guess, recover in a degree from the sort of unprecedented events that have unfolded, and how to be agile and quick in developing a strategy whilst you actually don't have any control or idea about what's going on in the world around you. So again, moving to the next slide, I'll just share some of the, I guess, key points that we looked at when we obviously looked at, I think, and a multitude of companies have been forced to look at their strategies in light of what's happening in the pandemic, and we obviously had to take a certain look also. Our business is thankfully quite sort of stable, and people effectively need to get payroll services for their employees as long as they're in business, so that's sort of helpful. But I think some of the things that we looked at is, and the learnings that we've had around this space have been to apply flexibility and to have that agility so that you can make quick turns and fast decisions, and that you have that sort of dimension of like the decision making in your company is effective and quick, and that you focus and that you develop a couple of scenarios, so your famous plan A and plan B, so that if something fails in your first plan, that you still have some other options that you can turn to. And then for us as well, I mean, Ascender is very much a people first type of organization. And for us, again, overlaying our decisions with what that meant to our employees and the employees of our clients was always helpful in showing us what the right path would be when we made decisions. And then finally, because I guess I'm always a bit of a silver lining type of person, it's always an opportunity to improve as well when we have changes like this. So we really can make changes into, that make us better as an output of it. So, something may feel bad today, but it may have some good results for us at the end of the day. So I think that being said, looking at that strategy, you always need to consider science, facts, and data. So you might have a good gut feeling, but I think you're always very well guided if you have a little bit of scientific evidence and backing and numbers at your hands as well when thinking about what to do. So I think that's a good segue to move over to Alvin. Maybe let him introduce himself first and then move to his space.
Thanks, Ina. Great segue to my section. Really happy to be here to share some of my observations and insights I've gotten over the last few years. I think over the last 9 years of my career, I've been kind of immersed in the world of talent, mostly at LinkedIn. And I've been really fortunate where LinkedIn has a lot of great data, which allows me to analyze certain trends like, how is internal mobility shaping up? How is diversity progressing? What skills are emerging and so on. And a lot of this has to do with talent optimization, right? Which is what Ina said. And I want to emphasize how important talent optimization is in today's world. And the reason is because the world is changing very fast. And fast is the key word here. It's changing so fast that increasingly we see CEOs turning to CHROs to say, I need you to lead our workforce into the future. And when we talk about the future of work, a lot of times we actually say that most elements of the future of work are already here today. So we need to act fast. The next slide talks about data. And the key to any optimization strategies is always having data and the ability to analyze it. And it's prevalent in every industry. If you talk about Netflix's recommendation engine in ensuring that you get the best video, or you talk about in farming, in agriculture, where data is used to actually increase the yield of crops, thereby improving the productivity of farms, or even at LinkedIn, where we use data to understand what causes or what jobs do we recommend to people, right, so as to engage them. In this case, it's the same for talent as well. But here, this example that you see is one of my favorite examples of how data is used for strategy optimization. It's in the field of basketball. So the graph shows the average number of three-pointer shots taken per game in the NBA. And you can see that this number has actually risen over the past 1 or 2 decades. Now, in basketball, the traditional sense of playing it many years ago was that the team was kind of aiming towards penetrating the defense of the opponent and getting someone to score a 2-pointer jump shot near the net. But over the years, analysts realized that you can actually have someone throw in a 3-pointer shot from further away from the net. And they realized that over the course of the game, even though the chance of getting the ball in is lower, you actually score more points than having 2-pointer jump shots nearer to the net. So what I love about this example is that a very simple analysis of data and probability has led to a whole evolution of the game. And I hope this inspires us all, because you can almost apply it to the world of talent strategy as well, where very simple analysis even of the data that you have today for your talent strategy can lead to massive changes in how your company succeeds in the competition. Now I'm going to talk about 3 trends that I see are quite prevalent in terms of how companies will have to be more aggressive in the coming years to ensure that the company succeeds. And I hope as we go through these examples, you'll be thinking about what kind of data you have and how you're going to use the data to optimize the strategies for each of these 3 areas. And the first one, if we go to the next slide, is really about future-proofing your workforce. Now, you see many charts like this up and going to the right, where we talk about certain skills that are emerging very fast. In this case, it's about recruiters. I remember joining LinkedIn in 2012, and people didn't really talk about data analysis skills for recruiters at the time. But look at that skill actually doubling over the last 4 years from 2015 to 2019. And this is just one of many skills. If you look on the right side, if you click next, you see many occupations are actually on the cusp of getting on these emerging skills as well. For example, you have more analytical functions like sales operations, investment bankers, where they were used to using Excel and analysis on Microsoft Excel to actually do their analysis. But data is getting bigger today in terms of size, and it's no longer just downloading Excel spreadsheets, but it's about having coding knowledge like SQL to be able to query data from data warehouses, and then using techniques like Python to actually analyze them. Or you have leaders who now need to understand how to better manage their team remotely, which again wasn't that important a topic just a year ago. We have auditors increasingly going to engagements and being pressured to actually talk about analytics and position and pitch the analytics solutions to their clients. And the whole notion of blockchain, which is really about decentralized ledger for transactions. And governments who have always been the centralized authority for regulation now need to understand what kind of role they need to play in a world where blockchain is becoming bigger. And the list goes on. So as I talk through these examples, you will start to realize that these are inevitable changes that have already come in to some extent. But I can safely say that more than 50% of the people in these occupations have not made the switch or have not kind of upskilled themselves to adapt to the change. So it's important to understand how we can help them, how we can enable this workforce. And two observations that I've had on why companies lack in this kind of upskilling transition, right? One is that many organizations are still taking a very traditional centralized approach to learning and development, where it's all centralized to the L&D department who decides most of the stuff. And the other one is there is incomplete competency mapping being done for the key occupations, and that the benchmarks being used to understand where you are at in terms of each competency is actually lagging against the competitors. So this is where data can really solve. And you need to understand what strategies and what data you can use to help optimize the strategy of future-proofing your workforce. If we go to the next slide.
I guess, Alvin, if I can jump in here, I think one of the things that we see with sudden events like the pandemic that we're experiencing is that they tend to bring things like this to a head. So you sort of knew that this was, so you see the trend sort of building, but right now sort of you become acutely aware of certain things because they're pushed to the forefront. And I think that's what's sort of interesting about events like this, if you look at it clinically.
Exactly. And some companies who have been at the forefront of change in digitizing their workforce, right, actually saw the massive gains in terms of the leap they have against their competitors. And these changes are going to happen again and again. These events, hopefully not the pandemic, but other events will happen. And companies will be caught off guard and they need to find a way to adapt fast.
Yeah, or I guess if you find those sort of technical aspects of it daunting, but like for me personally, I thought the fact about remote managing, I mean, we actually had a distributed workforce already. So we actually got a bit of a jump with my team on the actual working from home because this was already the way that we were used to working. So it wasn't such a huge switch to sort out Teams meetings and things like this. Whereas I saw others struggling, which I hadn't sort of appreciated in the past. So it was very interesting.
That's great to hear. In the next slide, we actually talk about one of the kind of tactics, I call it a build and buy strategy, in ensuring that companies can continue to have an optimal workforce fast enough. And again, the notion is that things are changing so fast that you won't be able to hire the perfect talent or the talent with all the required skills that you need. And this is where we need to start to understand what kind of skills in the role that you're hiring for, what kind of skills are kind of the baseline skills that you need to be hired in, and what skills can you actually train them up on the job. This graph here that you see is actually a graph of skills of my previous team at LinkedIn. So what we needed to hire for was analysts who obviously can do the analytical work, but also handle big data environments, which very few companies had a few years ago. And also be client-facing, be able to do presentations and consultations in front of clients, which again was not common amongst data analysts. So what we had to do then was we analyzed which of the skills were kind of more frequently bought into and what skills of our analysts did we actually train them up over the years. And because of these analyses, we were able to sit down with the recruiter and say, all right, let's manage the expectations of our sourcing techniques and also what we put on the job description. And this actually led to a much faster time to hire for us. So data, I think this is one example of how data can tactically help you in building an optimal workforce when things are changing so fast. Now, the other aspect in the next page is actually on engagement. And so many research houses have come out to say that engagement is probably going to dominate all HR discussions over the next 1 year. It's crucial in these times. So on the left here is a graph that shows an employee burning out risk has actually reached a 2-year high in August 2020. I don't have the latest numbers, but I think anyone would be kind of fair to say that the burnout risk, the engagement, this has always been a challenge and has continued to increase in terms of intensity over the last few years because of the pandemic and the work from home scenario.
And I think sorry, I'm jumping in again because I found it. And I think the real thing here is that, not being a doctor, but I understand that a lot of work-related fatigue and ultimately burnout is driven by the fact that you lack control over prevailing circumstances. You don't have control over the workload to a degree as well. And I think in these types of situations, you have to consider the emotional workload as much as the real, genuine company workload, if you will, and sort of say,
Yep.
it's probably been a very difficult year for many of us, and it's no surprise that the numbers are what they are. So certainly organizations are also looking all over for ways to make this something that is less of a problem going forward, given the sort of significance of this situation again.
Exactly. And managers have to understand that employees themselves being stuck at home most of the time is not something that they're used to, and they're feeling all sorts of emotions, like you say. But
Yeah.
there are,
what is the appropriate level for the organization to become involved in that, right? Because you're sort of encroaching on the home as well when you tell them, you know, why don't you do a bit of yoga? Just leave me alone. I just want to do my work, you know. So it's a bit difficult, but organizations traditionally haven't necessarily sort of butted into this space that much. So it's a challenge, I must say, as well, from again a managerial point of view, to say how far can I go?
Yeah, it is a challenge, but I'll argue to say that there are also kind of areas where managers will need to understand what they can control, or even things like work-life balance. It may be hard to kind of infringe in the personal life of others, but how do we encourage work-life balance? How do we encourage people not burning out and balancing kind of where they are emotionally? So over here, I think there are three main things, kind of questions to think about in terms of optimizing engagement. I have them on the right. And the first one probably has more to do with the collection and presentation of data, which is what is the time lag between the survey to the analysis results given to the team, right? And is it days, is it weeks, is it months? And I'm saying this because that's the range I've seen amongst companies still today. And if it's weeks, it's probably even probably late, even if it's weeks. And things are moving so fast. You could have a vaccine rollout in your country the next month and so on. So we need to have kind of almost instantaneous results to look at it. The second one is, how are leaders accountable for engagement scores, right? Most companies, I wouldn't say most, but there are companies who think still of engagement as something to measure, but are slow to act on. And this then leads to the third one, which is how are we investing in leaders to support employees. Now, there was an interesting survey, I think, done 1 year ago. The study showed that 26% of managers, only 26% of managers feel that they are equipped or skilled to actually foster individual and team engagement. Now, that to me is a very low score. If you combine that with another study that shows that the relationship with managers is actually the top engagement factor. This is something which companies need to understand. How do they empower the managers? And managers need to understand the role that they play in terms of engagement as well. Now, another thing about data here is that data is used in a lot of these survey analysis to understand what really drives engagement. And it also leads to kind of debunking myths. For example, I think there was another study that showed that 89% of employers think that pay or salary is actually the main reason why people leave. But the study showed that only 12% of employers leave because of pay. Now, I don't know what the real number is. It could be 12, it could be 20, it could be more, but definitely a lot lower than what people think it is, especially for millennials. The third area I want to talk about is in the world of remote hiring on the next slide. So the proportion of remote jobs applications has actually grown over the last 1 year, as you can see from the graph here. And for some of the countries like Australia, China, and India, the growth is especially much larger than countries like Malaysia and Singapore. Now, I would argue that this is only a start, and this is only a fraction of what it can be. I think over the last 1 year, it has shown that a lot of assumptions have been challenged. The assumption that remote work can't work has actually been challenged. And right now, more companies are actually equipped to have remote working because they have migrated data and things onto the cloud. There are tools today to kind of ensure collaboration, even if you're remote. And you need to think of the benefits that you can get from remote hiring or remote work as well. And one very key distinct advantage you can have is that the supply of talent that you have, if you're willing to remotely hire, is actually a lot larger, where you're not constrained to just your country, especially when borders are closed today and are kind of foreseen to be closed over the next 1 or 2 years, right? And that there is also an increasing supply of talent in developing countries that are really good talent as well. So if you're willing to kind of challenge these assumptions and go out of your normal locations you realize that there's a good supply of talent out there that can supply you with the workforce that you need for the future. And this is where, again, data is important, because you need to look at the demand and supply of talent to understand, which roles and which countries do you consider for that. Sorry, Ina.
And I promised I was going to come back to that cultural overlay that I mentioned in the beginning, and this is actually the perfect place for it, because you do say that, you look at Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, it's like, and one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the impact that the collectivism that we see in Asia typically it has with the acceptance of flexible work. So you've got your traditional, being present and being part of a group as part of the way of working. So you're sort of in that same team, in the same building, in the same room with your peers. Everyone has a little bit of an eye on each other, and that's a valued and appreciated way of working. But now I think that sort of trust among the team, that work actually gets done even if you're not in that collective group, or that the collective can be defined as something more virtual than actually physical, has also helped a lot. And I think that the local companies that are now coming into the conversation, like you look at organizations like DBS talking about redesigning work to allow for flexibility, it will also help further the trend, because I think honestly we are all seeing roles in our organizations that are very difficult to fill, which would be much easier to fill if you had, I guess, almost an infinite supply of global resources at your beck and call. So I think solving structural issues about how to hire is one thing, but the other thing is just being open to the options that this could bring to you.
Exactly. And being open to the approach in, how do you handle remote work environments? How do you engage teams remotely? I think the approach will be different. And there is no one approach, because different approaches will work for different cultures and different organizations.
Sure.
Now, the last thing I want to say on the next slide, we've went through the 3 areas where I think are important for human capital to look at in terms of talent optimization. But be wary of the risk of optimization as well. And being an analytics professional, I'm very wary of this. In any kind of optimization model that we build, we always want to avoid the scenario where we are overly aggressively going optimizing for certain metrics or goals, but losing sight of the initial kind of larger mission or vision that we have. And in this example here, you can see that Amazon many years ago actually scrapped a secret AI recruiting tool that showed bias against women. And that's because in all optimization models, if the input is skewed, the output is skewed. And so the only way to go around that is to ensure that while we optimize for certain results or metrics, we need to ensure that we keep diverse opinions. Whether you have an intentional committee to discuss these things, or just making sure that you're not losing sight of the larger goal, we need to ensure that the diverse opinions are always there to challenge our approach.
I think this is the risk, and so such an excellent example. I think it's just a good reminder of checking ourselves as well when we do these things, because when you have a lot of data, you can typically slice it in different ways, and you can use different angles to look at the numbers and say, well, actually, if I look at it this way, it kind of seems to prove my point. Which is the risk that we have in business, is to be less than transparent and to look for results that support our hypothesis, rather than sometimes taking the help of scientists and saying, yeah, but actually really clinically, that is not what we see. We don't see that trend. But, obviously you can leave out a part of the results, or you can, limit yourself to look at certain numbers, which will then help you because you're looking to achieve business goals. But sometimes it's also like, depending on the importance and magnitudes of the project, it's important to also say, am I being honest? Is this a question of integrity for me, or is this something that would influence others to a degree where I'm not comfortable with? So I think we're talking about really big questions here, but if you look at that example, that unconscious bias that those, I assume, largely male developers would have just sort of seeped into the product, and if the secret wasn't out, nobody would know about it, I guess, at the end of the day. So it's really interesting.
It is. And I think having diverse opinions from different cross-functional partners are important as well. I do see this the skill of cross-functional partnership or cross-functional leadership becoming even more important, especially in remote times. Companies are also challenging, like while we say that people are more productive, original ideas or creative ideas coming up because people don't meet in the hallways anymore. So lots of things to think about in the future of work, lots of things to optimize for, but we always have got to challenge certain assumptions.
Thanks, Alvin. Oh, look, that's absolutely fascinating. And we obviously had a prep call and everything, but I could have sort of spent longer having that conversation with you. I think this is one of those things where where you leave the conversation really energized. I mean, it's a big topic and it's a daunting conversation, but that whole, like, there is obviously, and I think everyone agrees, there is a need to think about how we're sustaining this remote working setup. How do we make sure that our employees remain engaged? How do we support them? How do we support their managers? Because famously, people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad managers, as the saying goes. So what do we do about not just guilting the managers, but actually giving them proper tools and techniques to support their team so that they, that everyone can, I guess, prosper together. So I think if we move along to the next slide, there's what we've discussed today, and it's sort of touched upon some of these things at least. So we've talked about the fact that the team structures look a bit different, and Alvin was making a really important point previously about the need to continue to think about diversity, and to think about diversity not as I guess a factor of how we look, but really as a diversity of thought, diversity of opinion. I think because that's the only way to actually truly get better, is to allow for dissident thoughts into your process, and to get somebody who disagrees with you to come in and opine on it, so that you get that other opinion, so calibrating. And then remote work, we mentioned the fact that this is a reality, and this is actually a reality that lots of us enjoy to a degree. The freedom to regulate your way of working is enjoyable. But then another question is, how do we maintain the strong relationships? I mean, for me, coming into office and having a little bit of chat with the team is one of the things that actually really energizes me. So how do I keep that up in a way where, in a place where I can't see them? And to be fair, it's not quite the same thing to see somebody on the screen. So how do we go about working around those things? So in the strategy development slide, I already mentioned the fact that there is a real need to be quite agile here. And I know that that's a word that probably irritates a lot of people, but that whole, like, maybe letting go of some of the structures that we've set for ourselves in our own heads, and are questioning why we need such a long time to turn decisions around will be helpful. And saying, look, is there a real need to have this process, or could we also just decide? So, as a practical example, for a lot of organizations end up building very complex recruitment processes with multiple layers of interviews and approvals, because the historical situation forced them to be very guarded about hiring. But then those structures are never undone. So there are probably similar examples in your organizations that you could look at to say, look, is this really necessary, or is this a historical carryover that we're taking with us? You'll see the little news clippings on the side there, obviously sort of directed this as well. And I did mention DBS as one of those sort of early movers to say, let's look at how we work and see that we are actually looking at the structure of work, so we can support remote work better, that we can support 4-day work weeks and things like this that haven't been quite typical. There are also obviously, I guess, call outs from the employee side saying they need more support. How can we get better? What can we do as organizations to get better? What kind of support can we get? And then as we talk about mental health, which is such a topic of importance, and how do we, again, go to our manager and say, look, you're actually okay. You're okay to ask your team if they're okay, and it would be nice if you did so, but try to find those boundaries and say you shouldn't go that deep in, but you could. It would be nice if you don't have that responsibility, but I'm sure it would be great if you had an understanding of how your employees are doing. So there's a lot here that we could discuss for a long time, but yeah, just really fascinating. And Alvin, thanks for being here. It was really good to talk to you today.
No problem. It's a really important topic, and I think to kind of round it off as well, one important thing to take note, whether it's remote work or new team structures, is that we don't have to think of a huge framework to, when you roll out, you don't have to roll out to the entire organization. You can think about experimentation. And I think the idea of agile and minimal viable products and so on have actually caught on to other fields, including HR. And the key is to experiment and understand what works first.
That's such a good note to end on. Thank you. So start small, don't be afraid, right? And then we'll round up there for today, and hopefully you've all gotten lots out of the conversation. I sure have. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ina and Alvin, for the enlightening session. We will now go ahead and take some questions. Just a reminder, if you could just type your questions into the chat box in the control panel. Just give it a few seconds. Okay, we have our first question. It's from Angela. Okay, Angela says, I agree engagement is important. Can you share key pointers on what an organization should start implementing first?
I think, Alvin, I'll let you probably chew on it for a little bit, but I'm going to guess, if you don't mind, just based on the direction we were going here, I think understanding your current asset situation is probably going to be pretty important. So looking at that, if you've only got feeling-based metrics about they look like they're a bit unhappy, what should we do? Then maybe implementing a bit of a survey to say, or a checkpoint to say, well, what is the pulse of the team right now? What is our baseline and where do we want to be? And then sort of taking it from there would maybe be a starting point. Is that, you get on board with that, Alvin? Is that
Yeah, exactly. I think understanding the drivers of engagement is probably the most important starting step. It's no longer enough to say that our employees are not happy. You need to understand why. There's a lot of obviously science behind it nowadays. So there are techniques to get to that why. And I think it's also important to have more regular pulses nowadays. Like I said, things are happening fast. Annual, or I would argue even semi-annual surveys may not even be fast enough to capture the pulse.
And I think what you get for responses will obviously inform what you then need to do next. So let's say you've got just to come up with a really silly example, if you've got an employee health and safety issue, then you're going to need to deal with that. But if you've got people feel underskilled for the jobs they're doing, you're going to need to be dealing with that. So it's really important you ask the questions in a way that you get honest answers that you can actually work with, rather than doing, like, I think you were alluding to this earlier, and maybe be a bit more frank, but when you do those surveys, a lot of it is just rubber stamping. So you say, we do surveys, here's the results. And the so what of those surveys is maybe sometimes lost a little bit. So what are the real actions that come out of them?
Thank you. We have another question from Ross. Ross is asking, how should organizations evolve their learning programs to cater to such a fast-changing landscape?
Right. I can take that and jump in after that. I think there are multiple fronts to look at that. I think one is even understanding what we should be upskilling in. And like I said, if we are kind of centralizing a lot of that authority and ideas on the L&D team, there's a lot of responsibilities when the world is changing so fast for so many occupations. So there must be some thought into thinking about how do we map out what competencies are required. And it should be both top down and bottoms up. Getting more involvement from the employees to kind of chip in what do we think needs to be we need to be upskilled in, so that we can future-proof ourselves. And then there's all kinds of learning methods nowadays, and we need to understand that the learning patterns for different audiences are different. I remember doing kind of this study where we looked at different demographics and looking at learning behaviors. They're entirely different. There are people who prefer to learn on weekends. There are people who prefer to learn at night. There are people who prefer to, instead of taking like a 1-week course in Python, they prefer to take like a 3-minute video just to understand like how do they do what they need to do right now. So we call it like micro learning, for example. So just understanding the different types of learning behaviors out there can really help.
I think maybe the only thing I would add to that, you used the term build or buy earlier, and I think one of those things is say, look for abilities to leverage your internal teams as well in training. And I know that when somebody else in the business tells me something, there's got a great interest, there's a great authority, and you're like, wow, that's so exciting. And then when you go to external training, you try to focus and you train. So I think that whole like blending the different ways that you acquire knowledge and making sure you get external input, but also leveraging people that you have in your group might also be quite powerful to get there. So that's all I would say.
True. Thank you so much, Alvin and Ina. Looks like we are on time. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate you being here. If you have any questions, please continue to put into the survey that after this webinar. So we will see you the next time. Thank you very much, Alvin and Ina.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Thank you.